Arthur had been working as a 911 operator for a couple of years. You come in, put on a headset and go out and save the world. You get all kinds of calls, sometimes jokes from dumb kids, sometimes pranks from smart ones, sometimes police calls for noise in the yard, or complaints that a neighbor is burning a fire near someone's property, and of course, cases requiring emergency assistance. Then there were the crazies. They called fairly regularly, but there were times when they had aggravations too. Spy voices from the vents and stuff like that. Last week on the news, they said there was a comet headed for Earth, and a few crazies called in screaming, "We're all going to die." Operators have behavioral protocols for this as well. All operators always had the most complete, first-hand information about the situation in the city. Calls were indeed coming in a constant stream, and it was extremely difficult for anyone called to be memorized. This girl's call was memorable for Arthur. She called the most usual quiet shift. There weren't that many calls, mostly routine. Someone needs to call an ambulance. Someone needs to get a cat out of a tree. And there's this girl. In a worried voice, she asked when the state of emergency would be declared in the city, and whether she could get a car pass to go to her brother. Not that Arthur was confused, but at first he thought that she was calling from another region, and the call had been forwarded to them by mistake. Perhaps somewhere in another region, or maybe in one of the states, there was some natural disaster, and the call came from there, and Arthur just doesn't know what's going on yet. But the girl confirmed that she was calling from their town. She sounded nervous, but she sounded perfectly normal, not like the city's crazies who also called 911. Arthur tried his best to explain to the girl that it was completely free to leave the city, that there were no plans to declare a state of emergency, and that no food rations were being issued. The call was so strange that Arthur remembered it not only for that shift, but also for the next weekend. And on the last weekend before his shift, everything happened. All the news first filled with scientists' reports that the comet was flying the wrong way, the way comets should not and could not fly, and then that this object was not a comet. The Minister of Defense talked about the need to shoot down the object, but an emergency meeting decided to use it only if there was a threat of collision with the Earth. But the object dropped speed, and satellites relayed information that it was a spaceship. It had all the hallmarks of a man-made object, but it didn't look like a rocket from any of the countries that had ever sent them into space. So it became clear to everyone that an alien spaceship was heading towards our planet. There was no time for arguments and discussions. In less than 24 hours, it went from being an obscure object that only astronomers knew about to a first contact, an invasion. The shock to Arthur was that the landing was 6 kilometers from his town in former agricultural fields. This was not an emergency landing. Thousands of people wanted to film this historic event on their phones. The military cordoned off the landing site and were ready to start firing at any minute, but it was initially forbidden so as not to start interplanetary contact with an act of cruelty. Government and military officials were going to attend the meeting, but they considered it too dangerous and allowed a group of civilians to pass through the cordons. Those who wanted to do so were alien fans, environmental activists and other freaks, wearing "I want to believe" t-shirts and carrying placards like "We've been waiting for you." They were half-crazy people, those who were Greta Thunberg fans a few years ago and who were now happy to meet the first spaceship by making contact. But there were no welcoming speeches. As soon as 4 robot-like creatures with large heads under a transparent spacesuit body got out of the descent capsule, those freaks started waving placards and shouting greetings. Some fell to their knees. One of the aliens pulled out a weapon. There was a bright flash, reminiscent of a flickering beam at a disco, and the entire group of greeters found themselves on the ground with identical holes in their heads, and, as it later turned out at the autopsy, their brains were boiled like in a microwave oven. The military instantly responded to the act of aggression and opened fire. All 4 aliens were destroyed. At their autopsy, it was found that the body itself was an exoskeleton for moving around the planet, and the creature itself fits completely in the head of the robotic body, resembling a toad but the size of a chicken. They were called toad heads in the press. And just an hour after the shooting, the media said that they had recorded about 40 pieces of similar objects of larger size moving towards Earth. Arthur was shocked by this news. All night he stayed up and watched the situation, and his home phone was cut off by relatives, friends and acquaintances from other cities, trying to understand what was going on by asking an eyewitness from the thick of things. Despite what happened in the morning, Arthur still had to go to work because aliens are not a coronavirus, and in an emergency a 911 worker must be at his post. The phone was red hot, the calls were coming in all the time, and Arthur and the other operators were hard at work. And then the girl called again. Arthur even recognized her voice, despite the hundreds of calls that had passed since her last call a few days ago. This time the girl spoke even more excitedly, asking where the underground shelters were in her neighborhood and what categories of people could be the first to take shelter there, whether they would issue protective equipment to the population, asked many other questions for which Arthur had no or very little information. The feeling that had been created by her first call intensified and became eerie, as if the call had come from the future, where the situation was much worse than it was now. And after the end of the shift, coming home and turning on the TV, Arthur learned that the city was in a state of emergency and that the entrances and exits from the city were blocked, and to move around, you had to get a car pass. This was exactly the same as the questions the girl had asked the first time, and now everything had come true. Arthur was creeped out by this, but the situation became even worse the next day, when all over the region and beyond, cases of the same ship's landing began to be recorded, and the military entered into serious opposition to the enemy forces. It was clear that our weapons could destroy the invaders physically, but their technology was superior to ours, and their weapons, when hitting the body or head, caused lethal damage by radiation, and when hitting our military equipment, disrupted all the electronic stuffing. Thus, our warfare was conducted by methods of the pre-electronic era. Our military outnumbered, but the enemy's weapons made the odds even. The bomb shelters available in the city used to be mothballed and used as underground garages, tire repair stations and so on. But now, it was urgent to equip them with places to accommodate people, because there were already real hostilities. When Arthur heard the news, he remembered that in his second call, the girl had asked about these shelters, and then he realized that her questions were a week or 5 days ahead of reality. He did not stop working. The operators of the 911 service should work in such situations, and now he waited for the girl to call again. He was sure for some reason that the call would come to his line, but it had been a week and the call did not come. Arthur hoped that he could find out something from the caller, at least ask what else she knows, and so he practically slept at work, especially since the workload really required overtime. But after 10 days, the girl still did not call back, and then Arthur decided to tell his friend and colleague Mike. He told him about the calls, remembered the dates of the calls and the dates of the events the girl had mentioned, and assumed that her calls were about 7 days ahead of reality. He thought Mike would make jokes about it, maybe tell him he was crazy for this job, but Mike didn't react that way and was completely calm about it. He said, "Arthur, this is wildly weird, but 2 weeks ago I would have laughed at you if you'd told me that fucking aliens were coming to Earth, and I certainly would have told you to go to a mental institution if you'd told me that we were going to fight those toad-headed bastards here in our town. But now it's happening in the real world, and that's why I quite believe that that girl could have called you as if from the future. But I'll tell you this, Arthur, she's not going to call again." Arthur asked, "Why not?" "Because she's in the future, and everybody's dead there," said Mike. George was on his way from Liverpool back to the capital. He was visiting his parents for a whole weekend in the city where the legendary band, the Beatles, had settled. Time flew by quickly. George didn't even notice that it was time to head back home. After sorrowfully saying goodbye to his parents, he got into his car and drove off, glancing in the rearview mirror a couple times. His parents were standing on the front porch of the house waving to him. George smiled, honked, and disappeared into the traffic. Wheeling down the night road, George noticed that he didn't see a single car. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen a vehicle come by. Of course, this could be explained by the dark time of day, but something seemed odd about the stillness. It was as if someone big, like a creepy forest monster, was about to leap out onto the road, grab the car with its claw, and swallow it and the driver in an instant. Maybe it's just imagination running wild, or just plain fatigue. George shook his head to ward off the frightening thoughts and increased the throttle a little. The engine hummed louder, echoing around the neighborhood. It was only a short ride home. A woman's silhouette appeared on the curb. George looked closely. She looked young, like a typical pretty college girl. She was dressed decently, jeans and a plaid shirt. Her long blonde hair waved down to her shoulder blades. The girl extended her hand with her thumb forward. George didn't drive past her and stopped at the curb right next to her. "Thank you," she said, jumping into the car. "What's a nice girl like that doing alone in a place like this at night?" George asked, glancing at her. Her figure was okay, but her appearance was odd. Slightly drawn forward face, oval head, eyes round as coins and deep set. The nose too correct and straight. She looked like she'd escaped from some children's cartoon. Her beauty was unrealistic. "I hitchhike," the girl replied. "Isn't it scary?" George asked. "No, I have my little friend with me." She tapped her pocket, where a pepper spray was partially sticking out. "That's right," he nodded. "My name is Christy. What's yours?" "George." Silence. A strange and unexpected silence, incomprehensible and frightening. George looked back and forth at the road, then at his traveling companion. Christy was staring out the window. If you looked closely, you could see her lips moving soundlessly. It frightened George a little, but he said nothing. She might be humming something to herself, or maybe she was just trying to say something, but couldn't find the words. There's also the possibility that she's having an affair. George didn't bother to speculate. He shook his head, pushing the delusional thoughts away. If this kept going on, he was going to get a headache. "Where are you headed?" George asked. "Nowhere," she answered. Then a loud beeping sound hit his ears. George slammed on the brake pedal, almost flying out of the car. He looked at the passenger seat, but there was no one there. Getting out of the car and looking around, the guy realized that the girl could not have jumped out, and he was driving at a decent speed. George returned to the car, grabbed his head and sighed heavily. What was that? Flashed the question in his head. Recovering from the shock, George drove on. The nasty beeping still echoed in his ears, causing a slight headache. He even had to stop for a breath of fresh air. When it passed, George continued on his way. Probably just a dream. Just a dream, he thought, but clearly realized it wasn't. He was awake, but the hallucination was justified by fatigue. Once again, he was deep in thought. George shook his head, rolled down the window a little on his side, and just stared at the road. The monotonous hum of the engine had a soothing effect on the boy that George began to fall asleep, but he held on so as not to fall into the ditch. The endless road, partially illuminated by headlights, was a little frightening with its dark shroud. Because of that strange incident with the girl, George was now afraid. Another silhouette appeared in the distance. George shuddered, looked closer. This time it was a man standing on the curb with his right arm outstretched. Conflicting feelings played inside George. He kept wondering if the fellow traveler was normal or not. He looked human. Nothing special, nothing that stood out. Just a man in a white tracksuit with a backpack over his shoulder. George decided to stop after all. The man quickly got into the car and thanked the driver, to which George nodded silently. "It's pretty cold outside," said the travelling companion. "It's always like this at night in Mother England," George said reluctantly, but he tried to hide his desire to keep silent. "I can't get used to it. I'm a visitor myself, and it's always sunny in my country." "Where are you from?" George asked. The traveller ignored the question. It seemed strange, but George didn't ask again. He just sucked in the fresh air from the window and looked at the road. The man was examining the interior of the car, glancing occasionally at George as if he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the strength to do it. They rode in silence for a long time, until the fellow traveller spoke again. "How long have you been riding?" "That's a strange question," and George thought. "It's been about half an hour. That must be a long time," the traveller said thoughtfully. "How can I put it?" "Tired?" the man asked sharply. "A little. We could stop and rest," he suggested. "Not now. I need to get to London right away," George replied. "Why?" "I have to work the day after tomorrow. I have to get ready for the day and everything." "Strange, strange," said the passenger again thoughtfully. "What's so strange?" George was a little confused. "Are you people always in a hurry?" George looked at his travelling companion, but instead of a man he saw a humanoid creature. His whole body was made of a purple-coloured sand. The whites of his eyes were oval, perfectly white as the first snow, and his pupils as black as the night sky. Instead of a nose, there were two small holes, and the mouth was slightly rounded. It smelled of clay and moisture. With every movement, even a slight one, the creature's body crackled and rustled. Slowly turning its head toward George, the travelling companion continued to speak. "I've been watching you for several long years now, and I'm always surprised, always in a hurry to get somewhere. Never think about time, and then when your end comes, you regret having been in a hurry all your life. You start to remember everything that happened to you, some sad, some happy. Who are you? Where are you from?" George asked anxiously. "I'm from the Red Planet. You don't have to be afraid of me. I won't kill you. I just want to know everything about people." The alien companion fell silent and looked up at the night sky. The stars, like 1,000 little fireflies, twinkled in the darkness. George followed his gaze. "What a beautiful starry sky," the Martian said with a smile, and immediately a bright white light shone down. George covered his eyes with his hands, causing the car to wiggle down the road. The light grew brighter and brighter. It went on like this for a minute until the car hit a tree. George hit his forehead on the steering wheel and lost consciousness. A few minutes later, he came to his senses and looked around. There was no one around. So it had been a dream after all. Such a thought made George laugh nervously. The boy got out of the car. The battered hood hinted at repairs. George looked up at the sky. Among the thousands of stars, one stood out with its bright light. "Really, what a beautiful starry sky," George muttered thoughtfully. He got back into the car and clearly smelled the wet clay. It wasn't a dream. In a small town in Kentucky, surrounded by dense forests and hills, there were rumors of strange phenomena occurring at night. The locals talked about luminous objects that appeared in the sky and mysterious sounds coming from the forest, but no one could imagine that these rumors would become reality. One night, when the moon was shining brightly in the sky, a young man named Jake decided to take a walk in the forest. He was a local and knew the neighborhood like the back of his hand, but that night, something wasn't right. The forest seemed too quiet, and the air was filled with a strange electric tension. Suddenly, Jake noticed a bright light coming from behind the trees. Intrigued, he headed toward the source of the light. When he got closer, he was struck with a sense of terror. A huge disc-like object was hovering in front of him, with bright lights that shimmered in all the colors of the rainbow. He felt as if his body did not belong to him, and he could not take his eyes off the UFO. At that moment, several beings emerged from the object. They were tall, with long arms and large black eyes. Jake broke into a sweat and tried to run away, but his legs wouldn't obey him. He felt paralyzed. The creatures came closer, and he felt himself being pulled into the light. In the same second, the world around him disappeared, and he found himself in a dark space. When Jake came to, he found himself in a strange room surrounded by metal walls. There were other people around who looked just as frightened as he did. They didn't know where they were or how they had gotten here. They soon realized that they were victims of kidnapping. They spent several days in this horrible place, being subjected to strange experiments. The creatures studied them, asking questions no one could understand. Jake couldn't quite tell if he could hear the creatures with his ears or just in his head, a kind of telepathy. It reminded him of a mystical UFO thriller, but he knew it wasn't a movie, and that made it creepy. And all the time Jake spent there, he never once felt like eating, drinking, or going to the bathroom. It was very strange. Finally, after they lost track of time, Jake and the others were put back into the light, and as before, Jake woke up in the woods, in the same place they had taken him from. But something had changed. Jake couldn't forget the terror he had experienced and the strange visions that haunted him after his return. He couldn't understand what had happened, but he knew one thing. Something he had experienced had changed his life forever. Since then, Jake had witnessed other strange phenomena in the forest and began to investigate what had really happened that night. He realized that he wasn't alone. There were others, those people who were with him that night in the strange room, and that the UFO might be coming back for them again. The locals began to notice that Jake was different, and soon rumors of his abduction spread throughout the town. But no one knew what had really happened or what the future held for them.